In the world of Subnautica, you need oxygen to survive, and away from the surface, that can be quite hard to find. Now normally you would use oxygen tanks to let you store more air and explore for longer, but what if you don't like oxygen tanks? They're heavy and slow and just uncomfortable. What if instead I only used bladderfish? These pink little guys are a common sight in 45-46B's oceans, and at first glance don't appear to be anything unique. Sure, they may look kind of like little love hearts with that strange shape of theirs, but what really makes them special? Well, my friend, bladderfish have a secret ability. They take water into their bodies and filter out air and nutrients to feed on. But if you can get your hands on one, that sweet, sweet oxygen will be yours for the taking, whether you're 5 meters below the surface or 50. All you have to do is eat one and you will gain 15 seconds of oxygen. How that quite works underwater is anyone's guess, but don't think about it too hard. So in theory, if you had enough of them, you could eat them for an endless supply of oxygen. So can I beat Subnautica using only the bladderfish to refill my oxygen? This means I can't use any vehicles or air pipes, and for an extra layer of challenge, I'll also build my base above the water, so I won't be getting any free oxygen from going inside. The run started like any other typical Subnautica playthrough. This was the easy stage, but I quickly realised that 45 seconds of oxygen isn't really very much. Even in the first area, I almost drowned once or twice through mismanaging my oxygen supply, as even the safe shallows can be deadly if you lose track of how long you've been underwater. I created some basic tools and got myself a sea glide and fins. On the one hand, this increase in speed was great, but the effect soon wore off once I realised I wouldn't be getting much faster than this for the entire game. After dodging some crash fish and getting sulphur, I created the repair tool in order to fix up my life pod. For now, this was going to be my only lifeline. From here, I decided it was time to get a habitat builder so I could start creating my own base, and to do that, I was going to need a few materials that could only be found in sandstone outcrops, specifically gold and silver. One place where these can be found is the Jellyshroom caves. This also contains the Degassi wreck, which I could scan to get myself multi-purpose rooms and build my own base, so I decided I would head over there to stock up on as much of these materials as I could. As the Jellyshroom caves start at 180 meters below the surface and descend all the way to 300 meters, I would need to stock up on bladderfish in order to stop myself from drowning. After collecting some, I headed down to the entrance of the cave to begin exploring, and this was when I faced my first real problem. Subnautica includes a mechanic called oxygen efficiency, and this means the deeper you go, the more oxygen you use per second. The basic oxygen level you start with is 45 seconds, but it's easier to think of these as units. So 45 seconds equals 45 units. When diving less than 100 meters, I would consume 1 unit per second, which while not an amazing amount of time, was manageable. But when diving between 100 and 200 meters, oxygen efficiency is decreased, meaning that 3 units of oxygen is consumed for every 1 second you spend below these depths. In this range, my 45 seconds of oxygen would actually only last 15 seconds, meaning I would need to eat 3 bladderfish to refill my tank. But if you think that's bad, it actually gets worse, as below 200 meters, oxygen efficiency is again decreased. So for every second I spent below 200 meters, I would actually use 5 units of oxygen. As I only have 45 units, this means I would run out of air in just 9 seconds. At this point, it really started to dawn on me just what I'd gotten myself in for, and I wasn't even sure if this was going to be possible. I was struggling to get down barely 200 meters below the surface, let alone the 1,450 meters I would need to descend if I wanted to reach the primary containment facility. After trying and failing to gather materials in the Jellyshroom cave and getting nowhere near the Degassi base, I called it quits and decided I would need to scavenge my materials from somewhere else, although I did manage to snag a diamond before I abandoned the area. I ended up travelling to the Cragfield as my next hunting ground, and thankfully this was a lot less deep so I could actually get some resources. While swimming around this area, I actually stumbled across a time capsule, and as fortune would have it, it actually contained some really useful stuff. Most importantly, it gave me a laser cutter that I could use to cut into nearby wrecks, as not only was this expensive for me to craft, costing 2 diamonds, but I also hadn't found the blueprint yet, so this was a big win. The time capsule also gave me a habitat builder and a stasis rifle, so I wouldn't need to craft those either. Rather ironically, the capsule also contained a picture of the Jellyshroom cave, and said many rewards would be found by those brave enough to conquer their fear of the deep. And at this point, I definitely did have a fear of the deep, and the Jellyshroom caves would never be seeing me again. I returned to my life pod to store my loot, and it was at this point that I started to notice another downside with my bladderfish only strategy. When you eat a raw raw bladderfish, as well as the 15 units of oxygen, you will also receive +6 food, but -4 hydration. If you cook the bladderfish, it loses this negative effect, but you also lose the oxygen bonus, so that wasn't an option. Raw bladderfish was the only thing on the menu, but when you're eating so many of them in order to stay underwater, that -4 hydration really starts to add up. Eating 3 fish and totally refilling my oxygen would lose me 12 hydration each time, something that could be potentially lethal if I didn't pay close attention. To combat this, I would need to carry water to rehydrate while I explored. Luckily, bladderfish can be turned into filtered water at the fabricator, so this wasn't a massive problem, but carrying water meant less space in my inventory for bladderfish, so I couldn't stay underwater for as long. If I carried nothing but a sea glide, I had 42 slots of inventory space for fish, which would give me 630 units of additional oxygen. But below 200 meters, this would only last 126 seconds. Temporarily defeated by the ocean's depths, I decided I would head over to the floating island. I set out in the dead of night, and by the time I finally got to the beach, the sun was just starting to peek over the horizon. I headed up to the Degassi land wreck to obtain the multi-purpose room for my own base and grabbed a purple tablet. I then ventured to the 2 observation posts in order to get lantern fruit and interior grow beds to grow them in. It was at this point the Aurora decided it was time to go supernova, but at least from this distance I was safe, and it was one hell of a view. I returned to the safe shallows and started to build my base. I only needed the bare minimum for survival, so I created interior grow beds for the lantern fruit and made all my basic necessities for crafting and storage. Then I came up with a plan. If I was going to make it deeper in this world, I was going to need a lot of bladderfish, and I didn't really want to gather them all by hand, so I was going to need a breeding program. If you place mature fish inside an alien containment aquarium, they start to breed, and luckily as the bladderfish is small, they will actually breed twice a day. So if I gathered enough bladderfish and made a big enough tank, I would have an almost never-ending supply. But first, I would need to find the alien containment blueprint, and that would be no simple task. The area I chose to investigate was the bulb zone, which ranged from a depth of 140 to 480 meters, which for my fast replenishing air supply was going to be a problem. Another issue was that now the Aurora's engine had exploded, the area was covered in radiation, so I crafted a radiation suit to protect myself. My target were the pieces of the Aurora's wreck found in the area, as this gave me the greatest chance of finding the blueprint I needed. I was also going to try and find a water filtration machine, as this would mean I wouldn't have to use as many bladderfish creating water. I stocked up on bladderfish and headed over to the area. The search for the wrecks themselves was actually quite tricky, as visibility was low and I was under constant pressure, with one eye on my oxygen tank due to the increased air I was using at this depth. I tried to stay above 200 meters so I would use oxygen at a lower rate. I actually had to come back to the area a number of times after restocking with fish, as I simply couldn't locate the wrecks in time or I was attacked by the local wildlife. I also needed to make sure I had enough oxygen to get back to the surface, or this was going to be a very short trip. One wreck I searched didn't give me anything useful, which was really frustrating as I had spent so much time and fish finding it and breaking in. Eventually I ended up finding another wreck where I found both blueprints, with the alien containment located outside and the water filtration unit inside the wreck itself. I made it back to the surface with 1 fish to spare. It wasn't even close. Now all I had to do was collect a ton of quartz and titanium in order to make all the multi-purpose rooms and alien containment facilities I would need. As time went by, I created a great tower that reached to the sky, with a huge aquarium filled to the brim with bladderfish. Even with this army of fish, I wasn't quite ready to face my fear of the deep just yet, so I visited the Aurora to retrieve the Neptune rocket schematics and repair the fuel leak in the engine. I also grabbed the cat poster, which was an essential part of completing this run. I headed back to base and stored the loot, and set off to the mountain island. Once I got there, I grabbed all the purple tablets in the area, but this one located underwater almost drowned me after I got disorientated and I wasn't sure which way I'd come in. Luckily, I made it out just in time. I opened up the facility and grabbed any ion cubes I could find, as these would be very important later on. It was getting close to the time where I would have to face my fears and dive deeper, but there was still a couple of advantages I could give myself for the best chance of success. The last way for me to increase my speed would be to find the ultra glide fins. These would increase my speed underwater by 2.4 meters a second. To make these fins, I would need to find the blueprint for the modification station and find the ultra glide blueprint itself. I searched the mushroom forest, but it took a while to find what I needed. Luckily, this area also contains parts for the Cyclops, and while I couldn't use it, I would need to make one later in order to get its shield generator for the Neptune escape rocket. I looked everywhere, but all I kept stumbling across was useless prawn parts and moonpool fragments. Eventually I did find the modification station blueprint and the Cyclops hull and bridge parts, so I'd only need to find the engine later on. The most annoying thing with this area was the long trip back to base to refill my inventory with bladderfish. I burned through them quick, and the journey back wasn't short. I even ended up getting lost a few times, so I had to put down a beacon to make sure I was being as efficient as possible over repeat trips. I ended up finding the fin upgrade next to Life Pod 13, so with everything now in place, I headed back to base and crafted the Ultra Glides. Now I had a dilemma, how to beat the oxygen efficiency problem that I faced earlier, but this time over a much larger distance. I gave in and crafted an oxygen tank. Wait, whoa, put that down. It's not what you think. I didn't actually use this thing, okay? Subnautica has a solution to oxygen efficiency and it's called the rebreather. This piece of headgear eliminates the debuff when diving deeper. The blueprint for this is unlocked by crafting a high capacity oxygen tank, so I needed to make one to get the blueprint. I quickly stowed the oxygen tank away in a locker and I made a rebreather and equipped it. I didn't want to use this until now as I felt it made the early areas too easy, but as a sea glide and a full inventory of bladderfish below 200 meters would only last me 126 seconds, and that was only if I didn't carry anything else like tools or water, I thought I'd need the extra breathing time to make this at all possible. It was finally time to begin my dive. I knew that I would need lots more bladderfish to give myself enough air to survive, so I crafted a few waterproof lockers. My plan was to line my route down to the primary containment facility with lockers full of fish, so I could refill my oxygen as I went. I located the most direct route to my goal, which was through the sinkhole on the border of the bulb zone and the mountains. This route was pretty much as straight a shot as I could get to the alien thermal plant and the primary containment facility, and importantly missed the disease research facility entirely, as you don't actually need to go there to complete the game. I stocked up on lockers and began my dive, but this was not easy. Not only did I have to get down into the Lost River to place the boxes, but I also had to get back up to the surface again, and that took a lot of fish just going between these 2 points, let alone putting any spare inside the lockers I'd placed. I did multiple runs down and almost died a couple of times from lack of air, and sometimes I ended up ransacking the lockers I had already placed just to make it back to the surface. This was a really tedious process, and it didn't even feel like I was making any progress because I kept having to eat the bladderfish I placed in the lockers, and this didn't even take into account the long trip back to my base after I'd reached the surface to go and get more. It also didn't help that a lot of my inventory was taken up by unplaced lockers, as I wasn't getting deep enough to put them down before I had to turn around. It's also really hard to see these lockers when they're floating underwater, so I ended up having to place beacons next to them so I could find them. I continued like this for a while before I realised this was taking way too long, so it was time for drastic measures. I returned to base and took everything out of my inventory that I didn't need, as I was going to go on a one-way trip down as deep as I could, and place down a load of lockers to free up my inventory space. I wouldn't survive the trip, but this would make all of my future runs easier. I headed down the passage that I'd been down so many times before, down the Lost River and into the lava zone, but I actually ended up getting a lot further than I was expecting. I didn't have a great deal of oxygen, health or water left, but maybe I could make it to the thermal plant. This was it. It was time to go all in. I abandoned putting down the boxes and kept pushing forward. I came up on the left side of the thermal plant and a sea dragon launched its fire breath right over my head. I dove into the tunnel and headed deeper inside, grabbing some kyanite as I went. I crashed through the thermal plant barrier with just a little health to spare. I wasn't in good shape, but I'd made it. I couldn't quite believe it. Then I realised because this was a death run, I hadn't brought anything with me that I could use to take advantage of being here. I couldn't grab the blue tablet I needed to access the primary containment facility as I hadn't brought a purple one with me to unlock the door. I took a quick look around and luckily the place contained an ion cube. Maybe I could use this to power up the teleporter that was here. I dashed back up the ramp while dodging the architect drones. Normally these aren't much of a threat, but I didn't have a lot of health. I ninja'd my way past them and placed the ion cube in the teleporter. It roared to life and I'd never been so happy to see its green glow. I stepped through and was teleported to the quarantine enforcement platform I had opened earlier. This was a game changer. I headed back to base and grabbed a purple tablet. I then travelled back to the teleporter and placed it into the facility's control panel, unlocking the blue tablet that I would need to access the primary containment facility. I then once again returned to base, as I would need to craft another blue tablet in order to make it into the Sea Emperor's enclosure. I also made sure to grab the ion cubes I'd found earlier in the quarantine enforcement platform to activate the teleporters found in the facility. I geared up with as many bladderfish as I could while also carrying all the items I needed and headed back to the teleporter. I gambled that the distance between the thermal plant and the primary containment facility was shorter faster than from the surface to the thermal plant, so it made sense to start from there, even if there was a bit of backtracking involved. This was going to be a big gamble, because if I died, I was about to lose a lot of progress, but I pushed that thought aside and set off. I travelled through the lava zone and down the lava tunnel towards the primary containment facility. Compared to the previous trip, this was so much easier. I was a little worried about the heat damage, but it turned out to not be as high as I thought. I managed to dodge the sea dragons in the area and made it to the facility. I put down my blue tablets and headed inside. My number one priority was getting the teleporter in the Sea Emperor's moon pool open so I had quick access back to this area. Funnily enough, with all of the Sea Emperors talking and her taking so long to move over to remove the sand from the teleporter, I actually used a good chunk of my oxygen supply, although she did eventually open the way and I used my ion cube to power the teleporter. From here, things were relatively straightforward. I grabbed all the items I needed to create the hatching enzymes, and with my rebreather, this was a lot easier than it had been before. I crafted the enzymes just in time before my bulb bush sample deteriorated, and I headed back to hatch the eggs. I was now cured of Kara, and I could deactivate the enforcement platform. The only remaining task was to craft a Cyclops to get its shield generator, and then craft the Neptune escape rocket. This actually took a lot longer than I was expecting, as I hadn't really gathered that many resources during my run. I had to head over to the Northern Bloodkelp Zone cache to grab 4 more ion cubes for the boosters, but everything else was relatively painless with the right planning. I finished crafting the rocket and took one last look around my home. I had room to take stuff with me, but I didn't really own anything. But then I thought of the bladderfish. They had earned their ticket off this rock too. I couldn't have done it without them, so I packed the rocket full with my little friends and set up all systems for launch. There was just one thing left to do. I headed over to the time capsule and filled it with the only thing those who would come after me would need to survive this planet. I sat down in my chair and blasted off. My mission was complete. Now with hindsight, maybe it's possible to do this without the rebreather, but it's definitely going to be tough. I throw out the challenge to you guys to give it a go. Now if you want to see me take on another Subnautica challenge, you should watch this video next to see if I can make the game's biggest ever air pipe. This one was truly painful. And special thanks to my patrons, Asmodeus Matthias, Graham DeLoye and Baron Windy for making this video possible.